Anita.
I'm sorry, I'm late coming. I'm joining in. Hey, Nancy, you beat me to the screen.
Wow, look at all those books.
Yeah, right. This is my sanctuary here. I feel secure surrounded by them, although I can't say that I've read them all. But first of all, welcome to everybody for joining us. I'm here with Nancy Silverton, who's coming to us from Los Angeles. Looks to me like are you in Pizzeria Mozza right now?
I'm at Keys Vaca.
Oh, you're one of your other restaurants.
Yeah, so it's on the same corner, and it's the newest meaning like 8 years old, something like that. But it is the quietest right now.
Nice. Well, that's good for us for right now. And Keys Vaca, for those who don't know, there's a little corner there in Hollywood where there's Mozza restaurant, the restaurant Mozza, then there's Pizzeria Mozza, and then Keys Vaca's part of that whole little trilogy, right?
Right. Have you been?
I've not since you opened Keys Vaca. Last time I was in LA, or at least to Mozza was before Keys Vaca was in existence. I think maybe it was just starting to come into focus, but that's a totally different concept than the restaurant.
But one thing that we serve here, the closest bread item, we should say, is a non-yeasted bread item, and it's a focaccia from the region of Liguria, from a kind of an unattractive town called Recco.
Oh, Recco, I love,
focaccia di Recco here, and that's famous. Sort of, every restaurant, I always say needs that bring back item, like why do people come, And in each restaurant we have it at Spaca, even though we're really well known for our large format steaks. What gets people in the door is our focaccia di Recco.
Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's always bread. Bread always is like good right? Bread will bring people, and it's interesting that you're doing that because I wrote about that, about being in Recco and having that, and even put a recipe out, a version that people can make, and it's so simple, and yet one of the most amazing taste bites that a person could ever have. And I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, the tricky part, well, two things is you really do need that pan, that copper lined pan, because it really does conduct the heat. But the other tricky part is the cheese. You have to have the stracchino at just the right age. So it's not so young that it just melts and not so aged that it doesn't melt. So
interesting. So do you have your stracchino flown in from Italy, or is it made domestically?
No, it's domestic. But we've worked with our cheese partner, who we actually get our ricotta and our burrata from, and we came up with the perfect age, the perfect days to age it. And so now it's consistent for us, but it took an effort, like everything does.
That's interesting, because I never thought about the fact that when you use the young cheese, that it kind of liquefies when you bake it, and as soon as you cut it, it just all runs out, right? So, and what I used to do to try to stabilize it was maybe that's what I was using was young cheese, because in mine, when it would run, I would sprinkle some like mozzarella in with it, to kind of like just somehow grab it and keep it from running up. So is it kind of one of those things where anyone who comes to eat at the restaurant just has to get that? I mean, it's
yes.
Well, I can't wait to come back and have it, because I haven't had it. When somebody else has made it other than me, I haven't had it in years and years and years, probably 15, 17 years since I've had it in Recco, which is, and for those people who don't know or plan to go, it's just south of Genoa. I think we took a train from Genoa down, about a 30-minute train ride down, got off, walked from the train station about a half a mile or so into the town center. And there were two famous restaurants. There were probably a number that made it, but there are two most famous. One was called Manuelina.
That's it.
Right? Is that the one you went? Because everyone would go to Manuelina. That's the most famous.
Well, they claim that they were the ones that invented it. So who knows?
Yeah, exactly. And so of course, the day that my wife and I showed up to interview them and to find out about this famous pizza that the folks from Al Forno had told me that I had to go to Recco to try, they were closed. There was nobody there. And
that's what happened.
And so we stopped somebody and said, there was somebody walking out of the restaurant. It was somebody who worked there. I think they were they were in the dishwasher or something, they were cleaning up, and they said, well, there's another place around the corner that makes it just as good, called Da Victoria, or so I think it was I just blanked out on the name, but it was these two brothers, these twin brothers, Primo and Secundo, as you would expect,
Yeah.
who had the restaurant around the corner, and they were open, and they welcomed us in, and they took us back, and they showed us everything.
Yeah.
And it was a, I don't know if life-changing is the right thing to say, but it almost felt like a life-changing experience to have it there and for the first time.
Yeah, I never had it before, same thing as I went to that town to have focaccia di Recco because I had heard about it, right? And I was so shocked. I thought it would be a traditional yeast risen, some sort of focaccia. And it was like, oh, wait a minute, this is a strudel or something.
Exactly. It's like, it really is kind of like a or a pita, like a pita, what's the word I'm thinking? Not a pita bread, but in Greece, they have these spanakopita, anything that ends with pita is flaky phyllo dough. And that's kind of like what it was. And so it forced me to kind of think about what focaccia is in a whole different way, because I just assumed focaccia. Oh, you got some. Ooh.
So right now, I know this is just impromptu, but this is not the subject of why we're here, but I'll just bore you for 1 second.
Yeah.
So right now you can't see Herbie, stick your face in. Herbie is our chef at the pizzeria. And right now we're just about to open pizzerias, not only pizzeria, but pizzeria, osteria, eat restaurants, Mozza's just opened in London, about to open in Cabo, going to open in Saudi Arabia, back in Singapore, like all these places. And we have to standardize our flour. So that's what brings us into what's happening right now.
Wow.
And I don't have the time, nor does Herbie have the time, to go to each location and work through the process of choosing a flour that's easily purchasable, or in some cases local, because that's the challenge to any bread baker. And we can get into the flour. The flour is the missing link to anything, right?
Right.
So what we're trying to do right now is actually work with Caputo, the Caputo, the brand Caputo, to try to be able to use them as a source, because currently they export all over the world.
Yeah.
And in this point, it would be ideal, rather than, so it might go opposite to some of our bread making philosophies that might be about choosing a local mill, perhaps, or at least sourcing it or understanding it, to something that's much more of a commercial product. But in our case, for this growth, we need it. Now, I was just at a restaurant bakery in New York where the baker is milling all his grains. Pretty exciting.
Nice.
So right now, Herbie just brought me the piece. They work together on it. It's not as light as ours.
Is this using Caputo, the Caputo flour then? The blend?
Yeah. So which one?
This one is Super Nuvola and
Super Nuvola?
Yeah.
I don't even know that one.
Yeah.
I've used that flour, yeah.
And Americana.
And Americana, mixing those two.
Is it a blend of the two?
Well, yeah, we have to come out, what we're learning and what I learned. I mean, I know so little about the scientific, technical part of bread making. But one thing I do understand is creating that cocktail, which is just really important, right?
Right.
And that's what it takes sometimes. And so that's what they're doing. I'm with them, I'm saying sort of like, look, you do the work. And if you can't duplicate or replicate closely to what we're doing with the flours we're buying right now. And, actually we're using our flours from King Arthur, which is a very consistent and a very good mill. If you can help us, then we'll switch, but you got to do the work.
Right. And of course, that's what they love to do, is if they come up with something you like, then they can create a mozza blend or something that then everybody would use. And this speaks to something that we have been talking about throughout the symposium, which is this notion of the transition from craft to scale.
Yeah.
And so when you're scaling out a restaurant concept like Pizzeria Mozza, which is when you had it in LA, you had total control of it. Now you're faced with the challenge of when you can't be everywhere at once. How do you maintain the standards?
And not only that, but you're also training non-bakers to make the dough. And that's another part that's a little bit difficult. And I know even myself how rusty I am, back in the days when I was at that bakery every single day baking, and I touched and I had a relationship with every piece of dough that was made.
Yeah.
100% different than now when our dough makers will call me in and say, what do you think is going on? What's the problem? I'm like, my guess is as good as yours. And I rattle off my knowledge of things that it could be, what was your water temp? What was, all those kinds of things that I know factor into irregularities, right?
Yes.
But, there's no question that a baker is a full-time job. A baker is, a baker on a level of what we're talking about is different than a hobby,
Mm-hmm.
And I've sort of moved into the hobby part of it, and I miss it. I really miss, because
and the funny thing is
you know what you're doing.
As you say that, we have a lot of people watching who probably would call themselves hobbyists as well, because they're not doing it, quote, professionally, but yet the hobbyists now are taking their craft so seriously that they're wanting to know, everything that the professionals know, and they do.
Absolutely.
And so there's been kind of a coming together of these two worlds.
Right. And I'm not putting down the hobby. I don't, the second career. It's just that you will never be a great baker unless you bake every single day, because every single day it's different. And that's the only way you know how to work with the changes, because they're vast.
Yeah. You got to put in your 10,000 hours, that you're going to get to be skilled. So this raises a couple big questions for me. It's number one, how do you train people that are all over? How do you train somebody in Saudi Arabia and in where else, Singapore, wherever else you said you were going to be opening, London? How do you do it? Do you do it by Zoom? No.
I'm there. They come here, and I have to say that our formula is quite forgiving, and there's little things that really help these days that didn't even exist or I didn't know of in my days. And let's talk about one, is the idea of folding your bread to strengthen the dough. That really, really helps, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Where we suffered kind of, I think, back in my day without that knowledge, and what it does is that folding the dough. And also, we can go back even a little further and say, when I first started baking, that word autolyse was not in our vocabulary.
Right.
That's another thing that helps to enhance the dough, right?
Yeah.
And so those are two big things that I think. And then also, that's the only doughs we're not making. We're not doing a bakery where there's many flavors. It's only the pizza dough we're talking about. So when you have one thing, you really can train someone. Now, this is the problem, though, is that they are baking not by feel necessarily, but by time, mixing on speed 2 for 11 minutes. That's what they're doing. At 11 minutes, they're going to the next step.
Right.
So they're using a recipe, they're not using intuition. And that is a little bit counterintuitive when you're a baker. Right?
But it takes time to kind of get to the point
I know.
to have that feel. But eventually, if they stay with it and stay with you, then they can put the paper aside and they can say, okay, I got it. And then you can use them in a whole lot of other things later on.
Right.
I know that people that have come and worked, for you and with you over the years have gone on to use that as sort of a stepping stone to be able to have their own places eventually. Like Matt Molina, who I met, was your first head chef at Pizzeria Mozza. Now he's got his own restaurant, right? That I think you encourage that kind of thing. and there's one, and they all end up winning awards if they work. They all end up winning their James Beard Awards and other things like that. So it's kind of cool that there's kind of the mother house that they come out of, and you must feel like a kind of a proud parent when you see them succeed out there.
Absolutely.
So some of the restaurants that are going to be opening, do you envision them being as big and popular as Pizzeria Mozza is in LA? Because you do a tremendous amount of volume there, and in fact, you don't make the dough in house; you have it made, around the corner at a bakery, at the old La Brea bakery, the original, place, right? Is it still being made that way?
Actually, we haven't made, and this is all because we don't have the space to shape or to store, because it's a 2-day bread. But interestingly enough, all of us are reaching for that silver lining of the last couple of years. And the silver lining for us was that all of our chefs every day shaped, well, somebody made the dough, but they all shaped the dough. To them, pizza dough came in a white box, rounded, and there were 16 pieces. That's how you made dough. Mm-hmm. And they all got to learn how to not only make the dough, because we rotated, and shape the dough, because the bakeries couldn't make our dough for us. And mm-hmm. So I think they all, as cooks and bakers at the pizzeria, grew tremendously over the last couple of years, because it was just recently that we went back to our bakery, Bub and Grandma, who we buy our bread from, to be able to make our dough. But for over a year plus, every day they were participating.
And so they
loved it. They really did.
So they were doing it from the first, all the way from the beginning to the end.
Yes.
Instead of just stepping into the end stage of it.
Exactly.
So that's part of the training now, that everyone who's taking on a location for you is learning.
Well, they have to, because they don't have a local bakery that I can trust.
So do they actually make the dough right there?
Yes. Yeah.
And then space becomes an issue then when you're.
Yes, but we're figuring it into the build out, which we didn't hear.
Mm. Yeah, right. Who knew? Who knew,
right? Who knew? But moving forward, we are.
Well, that's great. So in other words, you're always learning new things, and I'm sure when you start talking about scaling out and rolling out, a concept, you've got to put into practice a lot of the life lessons that you've had along the way. So clearly that's one of them.
Another lesson is realizing, not just resting on the laurels of everybody's enthusiasm when it came to our pizza. Where it really matters is how I thought. And I realized that there was some room for improvement or some changes, and that it could be better. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board a couple of years ago, and I did change our formula a bit. And that was really great. I mean, it took some time, and I added some rice flour into the dough, which made it more extensible.
Interesting.
I added spelt for flavor and a little color.
Yeah.
And I ended up adding olive oil, which I never had in my dough before. So I did work on changing the dough for the good. And I think that's something that we are constantly open to. And I'm sure it will change again. But right now, what happens to me is I go somewhere and I taste a better pizza. That's it. I'm so damn competitive. And I'm like, that pizza was better than mine. I got to go back.
Exactly. But that's exactly how it happens, how we grow. And I think all of us, anyone who's in the creative side of life, and most of the people who are watching this would call themselves creatives, we're never going to be happy just standing pat with the cards you've been dealt. You're always going to want to push the envelope a little bit and see how far you can take it.
And there's always new, ingredients and things like that, or technique that you hear about, and you want to see how it affects what you're doing, right?
Exactly. So for me, the takeaway of that is that we're always learning, and we need to be open to new things. And the interesting thing in the bread world is, because you and I started around the same time, many years ago in the bread world, and there wasn't a lot of knowledge to pull upon. And then all of a sudden things started coming our way. The Bread Bakers Guild came, and the knowledge of the French bakers, and and people, we're putting pieces together, and all of a sudden, like the auto lease kind of idea all of a sudden it's now a cliche. Everybody knows about it, but back
Yeah,
then nobody knew about it. Yeah. And
yeah, but also there was no one to talk to, no one to bounce ideas off of or troubleshoot, right? Bakers were hard to find. I think bakers now are so open to sharing, right, their knowledge and things that they've learned. I mean, I think probably early on, people still thought of things being secret recipes,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's been a big change.
Yeah.
And everyone's protecting their little
Yeah.
corner of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the guild, I think, played a big part in that because they
Yeah.
made that knowledge. It's kind of like open sourcing then at
Yeah.
that point. And the internet, of course, also made everything. And now you've got your Instagrams that make everything. Everybody wants to show you what they're doing.
Which also has another side to it, I might add. I was thinking about this the other day when I walked into a bakery that was truly, and I don't like to be that judgmental, but it was truly, the loaves were truly just very uninviting, right? And I'm like, okay, 25 years ago, that would have been okay, but you are not on an island. There are books, there are bakers, there's internet. You should know the difference between a pale, underdeveloped loaf and a properly executed loaf. So I always say there's no excuse anymore to make a bad loaf of bread.
That's true, and the bar has been raised, and everybody's expecting to follow it. So, which brings me to for my next question is that this it's sort of an evolution of knowledge and application and development of craft and trade, and you've been through it. You've even to have thought when we first had your first pizzeria Mozza Pizza or your first La Brea bread. That's not where it ends for you. That's just where it begins for you. I mean, that even was amazing. So you go, because you're always asking yourself, well, where can it go from here? How can it get even better? And you're out there in the world, you're seeing a lot of things that are going on and you're seeing what people are doing. What are you seeing where do you think it is going? And how are we going to get there? What are some of the things that every time I think that there's no room for another bread book, somebody comes out with a bread book that's even better than the last one, Yeah. So it seems like
as it should be. Like when people say to me now, like, do you have a suggestion for a bread book to buy? I never suggest mine because I think mine, although it's full of my spirit, as far as if you were going to buy one bread book, it's outdated. There's so many new things, So it's true. Each one should be better than the last. Otherwise, who's ever writing that book is not doing their homework,
Exactly.
It should be. But as far as, trends, and I hate that word trend in any kind of the food world, because to me, then it means that it's going to die, that it's only here for a short amount of time, right?
Right.
But I think that there really is, and I think this is a good thing, and I like good movements where people are really very, very involved in choosing, sourcing their products, mainly their flour and their grains, right? And I think that's important. And like I said, the baker Louis at Lodi in New York, which is one of Ignacio, whose name just escaped me last name, who this just opened Lodi, and they have a beautiful bakery component to their restaurant. And he has a jewel box of a restaurant with a beautiful oven, a beautiful mixer, and a grain grinder,
Yeah.
And he's grinding all his own grain. And that, I think, is definitely where people are headed now. They're not happy with just buying a commodity flour.
It's been fun to watch that unfold because when we all were starting out, those options didn't exist. There weren't small farmers growing regionally specific grains. There wasn't a Dr. Steve Jones testing out different strains and finding the right one for your area to grow, et cetera, et cetera. And then people wouldn't even think about grinding and milling their own flour in-house. It just wasn't part of the equation. And now a lot of people are doing it. It's like it's no longer sort of a niche idea. It's becoming a mainstream idea, which says something. It's leading to something else. But better restaurants, maybe better breads. So, and I imagine that you probably get to interact with some people in that side of the sourcing side, the growing side, the farmers, the millers, and things like that. Is that something that you see, in your travels? And are you encountering new kinds of flours or even different
Yeah,
grains?
and I'm certainly seeing whenever I go into a bakery, I mean, that's certainly something that's of huge interest to me is where are you getting your flour from, you know, because I just like to know. It's just interesting to me.
Well, let's step back for a minute because where we're talking about is kind of how you way back then to where we kind of are now. But in between, in your own journey, you did something that was, you know, I think maybe it's going to be part of your legacy, you know, of achievements of this growing list of achievements. And one, it was that you took a small craft bakery and made it and blew it up and made it mainstream. You took it to the world, at least to the United States, everywhere people could get the world. But and who, no one thought that that was possible. It was going to be, it's either you have your neighborhood bakery or you have, you know, your everyday bread. But somehow suddenly people could get La Brea bread anywhere, and that was a big breakthrough. Can you talk a little bit about, number one, the creative process that led you to being able to make that transition? Because you had to, you know, break through some maybe concept barriers that people would have about.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it was a slow growth, right? When I was first approached by a large company that did frozen dough, they asked if I would collaborate with them in a dough, a sourdough, because they were never successful in freezing, that they could supply all the supermarket chains and what, you know, that they dealt with. Now, the first thing, you know, back in those days when I was much more of a purist than I sometimes am now, you know, I immediately thought about the freezer is my enemy, right?
Yeah.
So I took a little time to realize that I forgot that how much I loved ice cream. And it's like, okay, well, maybe a freezer is not 100% my enemy. Maybe there is some places where it is, right?
So we owe La Brea bread to the ice cream.
Yeah, to the ice cream, right? Absolutely. So then I took it from there and I thought, look, why don't I have a conversation with these people, right? So I had this conversation and they explained to me, because I didn't even know it at that time, that the issue was freezing the bread solidly and not leaving a little bit in the center alive still. You could never use a sourdough bread in that way, you know, and that they knew, but they wanted me to show them how to freeze it right. Well, that I didn't know because I had no experience. And so I decided to go visit their plant and work with them a little bit, right? And quickly on, I realized, well, first of all, I know a lot more than they do. So why would I even develop a relationship? Because it didn't make sense. But what I did learn from them right away was that there was too much left once that frozen dough came out of the freezer for an in-store bakery to not succeed in. They would still need somebody to understand when the bread was proofed. They would still need to make sure that their ovens were calibrated, which, you know, in those in-store bakeries, they don't change out their ovens and they don't maintain them correctly.
Right.
How was that bread going to rise? Was every in-store bakery going to buy proofing baskets? Because you still need to proof, and you know. So I'm thinking this would never work. I think there's too much room for error. And then it was, I think I had been at a bread show or something, and I didn't even know what the world of par baked was about.
Mm.
But I saw it at a bread show, these par baked breads, and they were just terrible at that time. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And that's when it occurred to me that the idea of baking that bread 90%, 80%, 90%, and freezing it just to finish off that bake, you eliminated all that.
Yeah.
All the other issues. And so that's sort of how it started. And so we did it at our little bakery where we did these 80%, 90% bakes, froze them, shipped them to friends in different areas and had them finish it. And it was like, wow, this is as close as you could get. Now, the scale that we were talking about that we would have to be able to have a circular freezer and have these refrigerators was much grander than what we were doing then. The
Yeah.
whole idea of tunnel ovens, all this stuff was like, I have no idea. So I had to bring somebody in that was working with us that kind of had a mind for that. And we needed that person to work directly with equipment manufacturers because there was nothing then on the market that would handle our bread in a delicate way where our final product would not be 100% comparable to a hand-shaped loaf, which we were doing then. We never even used rounders at La Brea Bakery. We only used baguette molders and roll divider rounders, but not large. All the large loaves were always formed by hand.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get a piece of equipment to mimic that?
Yeah.
And that's when we spent a lot of time in Europe. Whether George Erasmus, our baker at the time, spent a lot of time in Europe tweaking these machines. So it really took a while and a lot of money.
And
And investment bankers, and then eventually a sale to be able to grow. And now we have these two huge bakeries, one in Van Nuys, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and one in New Jersey.
Yeah, outside of Philly, right?
Are making, we grew from having 50-gallon trash can tubs full of starter to silos of starters, those kinds of things.
I know, it boggles the mind to even think.
Yeah.
And again, each time you expand, you've got the challenge. Okay, how do we maintain? We've established a bar of quality that people associate with. I'm sure you remember the day that your baguettes beat all the San Francisco baguettes.
I know, that was a big day, right?
Yeah, in a bake-off, and it was like, that made the front page news. I was living in San Francisco at the time. It made the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, and people said, no, there's got to be a mistake. And I think they repeated the contest.
Yeah, they did.
And you won again, right?
Yeah, but you know what? And I have to say, just so you kind of understand my thinking process, what I thought about it, and I don't think it was just justifying this huge growth, but I was thinking about that. Not every person in every small town had the luxury of having a corner bakery to get a good loaf of bread. So here I was able to bring bread to places that ordinarily wouldn't have that option,
Yeah.
So that bread was never going to compete with our favorite bakeries in our favorite cities across the country. It was there for more of the masses that didn't have that choice,
But it worked, and of course, one of the signs of success is that a whole bunch of other companies tried to get into the same game.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And so now there's competition. There's other companies doing similar.
Lots of them.
Yeah, and so back then the idea of a par baked bread was relatively new. There was brown and served, there was proof and bake, there were all those things, but none of those were considered craft bread.
Right.
And then and I think what changed in people's minds was the realization that you could actually take a frozen loaf, put it in the oven, and not ruin it,
right,
and have it come out more perfected than when it went in.
Yeah,
that was a game changer.
Right.
So I think that's pretty significant.
Yep.
And so the creative process was basically just asking questions and then going and trying to find answers and using some of your key people to
that's the big thing. It's using the key people that could not only devote the time but really have that understanding. I think that for myself, as soon as there's a plug involved, I lose it. Give me a mortar and pestle, give me a beautiful wooden spoon, give me two hands to shape a loaf of bread, and that's where I shine. But when you get much bigger than that, I just can't. So I knew that I needed to pass the torch. And that's really around the same time that I stopped being the daily mixer, shaper, and oven person.
But it also freed you up to have other people so that you could go and continue to be creative and do things like restaurant mozza and pizzeria mozza.
Exactly.
and more. In fact, I'm going to forget to ask this later, so I'm going to ask it now before we run out of time, and maybe we'll circle back to this again. But I promised everybody I would try to find out from you, okay, a little bit of the backstory of how you ended up. I'm watching you on TV these days in these Subway commercials, going like there's a 1 second little clip of you, you know.
Oh, you mean I don't even remember my 2 lines anymore. That's how.
I know. It's like I went. I had to do a double take.
You got to refresh to be fresh.
Yeah.
So
how did that happen?
I'll tell you in a nutshell how that all came about, and it ended up being with their PR department, obviously, because that's how they brought me into this commercial.
Right.
But I don't know. Now I don't know. 3 years ago or 3 years plus ago, Mark Miller, my dear friend, Mark Miller. For
Sure.
Anybody that's below my age of 67 may not know who Mark Miller is, but Mark Miller was one of the most respected chefs of my generation.
Our era, yeah.
And in later life, he gave up his restaurants, Coyote Cafes, I think they were, and some other restaurants in Santa Fe. And he became a food consultant because that's how his mind worked. He really did well with that, and it allowed him to travel, and travels all over the world. Anyway, he was hired by Subway to revamp their menu, and so that meant everything that went in between the bread and the bread. So when it came to everything that went in the bread, that's the easier part to talk about. Everything has been resourced. And before I agreed to even do that commercial, I wanted, because that part I wasn't aware of. I was aware of the bread part, but the inside I wasn't. I wanted to know where they were sourcing. Were they making an effort to source from places that were responsible and ethical and all that? And they have, and that's part of their whole campaign. So I said, okay, you're not necessarily the devil. And just like freezers are not necessarily our nemesis, fast food doesn't have to be. In fact, I just opened up a little concept called pizzette, which is a fast food I call it quick serve concept with little pizzas, but that's a whole nother story. But anyway, so I'm not saying fast food definitely has to be, but the way it's sourced and where they're prepared. So they assured me that all of that was being re-looked at and revisited. But the bread part, so Mark brought me in because La Brea Bakery, although I don't own, and I am not affiliated with them anymore, they're one of the bakeries that produce the bread for Subway. Subway has a handful of domestic bakeries to help produce all of their bread because they're so big.
So big, yeah, no one group could do it.
Yeah, so La Brea is one of them, but they all do the same formula, same flour, everything, because when you're a franchisee, you have to be consistent. Okay, so they wanted to tweak their bread. Now, I had never had a Subway sandwich, so I don't know what was wrong with the bread. I know we worked on the bread, and so I was part of the panel to help when they would come back with samples to give my opinion. So I did that. I probably had 3 meetings with them over that about the direction of their bread to try to improve it. But remember, they were still looking for a soft, squishy roll. They were not looking for a crusty, hearth-baked,
French
baguette. No, they were looking for, so they knew what they wanted, but it was just improving that. So did that, and then I got a call from them a year ago or whatever, saying they are doing this campaign to promote it. And since I was involved, would I do this 2 seconds?
I see.
And so I thought about it. And I thought, sure, I did participate in the bread. They are making a conscious effort to relook at all of their sourcing of their raw ingredients, and that's important to me. So I thought that I would do it. So that's all.
So it wasn't so much that you reformulated their doughs.
No.
You were advising from a flavor
Exactly.
standpoint and a
I was
texture.
on a panel with a dozen people.
I remember when Tom Gumpel told me, I think he was involved in this project as well.
Yes, he was too, exactly.
Because he spoke at our symposium a couple of years ago, and
Right,
he told us then that he was working on something with them.
Yes.
And of course he dropped your name. He said, "Yeah, Nancy's involved too."
Yeah.
But the question I had back then is well, what do they want to do? What is it that they need to do to be able to take the bread from where people are used to it and not lose anybody because they've changed it, but actually have people go, oh yeah, it really is better. I really like it even more now, you know. And
Yeah, like I said, I have no history with them, so I don't even know what it was, but the changes were very subtle. I know that because in the end, they needed the same length. It was still white flour, so it's all,
well,
so,
I had intended, and I didn't get to do it, to go out to my local Subway here and get one of them before we had this. I wanted to see if I could tell the difference. It's not like what they had before was bad. I mean, it was functional. It wasn't great. It was classic to any kind of large chain, is that it was good enough. But what could they do to take it to another level? And I wondered if they did indeed take it to another level. And I wasn't sure if it was because they were going to make it more like multigrain, or were they going to use ancient grains in there? Were they going to do what? So
right.
But the other thing that I've learned, and maybe you can comment on this, is that it doesn't take a lot of improving to make a big impact on people. People always want things to be a little bit better than anything they had before, but it's not like you can say, okay, it's now twice as good as it was before. It only has to be better than it was before to, grab traction.
Yep. And which it did. Like, I know that when we started making bread back in the days that we did at Brea, to complement our restaurant that opened 6 months later, and we served a bread basket at that time, for free. I think that's really on its way out. Do you see, like, most of the sort of, or a lot of the high-end restaurants now are charging for bread and good butter. It's not just that free thing that you get at the beginning of the meal to fill up on.
That's right.
When you order less food. But what was just really interesting is, once you do that and your customers you become educated and they taste what good bread is, no longer would they accept bad bread at the other restaurants that they ate. So they would say, we went to we went to Campanile, the bread was great. You need to change your bread. And so restaurants were forced to make changes, as they still are, but now they're realizing that it's not necessarily just a cheap item to put on the table. Flour prices are higher than ever. The grains, like you say, the ancient grains that you might put in your bread are higher, and it takes skill to bake those breads. So it's not just a cheap thing. And so when restaurants started to remove that as something free, I think a lot of people were very, very upset about that, that they didn't understand. It was always free. Why is it not free anymore?
And there was some pushback, but at the same time, I think it's winning. That battle is winning because there has been such a change in the perception of the consumer of the importance of bread, at a meal at a fine dining.
What I'm finding is it's not okay just to charge for bread. You have to add that it's a French butter or it's a house cultured butter. They got to put the spread next to it to justify.
You got to have the schmear.
You got to have the schmear to justify the expense.
But that's true, but that's all, again, part of the experience, because it's elevated the role of bread in dining, to be comparable to the other things that are going on the plate, and that are coming out of the kitchen, which is, that's a change. We've had the opportunity, we've been around long enough now to watch this evolution. You saw it happen in LA from the beginning, when you started, chefing in LA, there was a paradigm shift in what was going on there. And again, it was monumental, and it had impact on the rest of the world, really, and the rest of the country.
Wolfgang used to always say to me that I had the most important role in a restaurant. And I don't mean ROLL, by the way, but the most important role in the restaurant, because the two parts that anchor your experience is when you sit down and you have the bread, and when you have the dessert when you leave. And those, that is the bread, brought you in, and the dessert sent you away, and that was your memory. And it is true that it is an important part of the dining experience.
Yes, and ever more so. And people, now we can say, I think a lot of people could say, and people should pay for that. They shouldn't expect it to be free. In fact, if you're getting free bread, then they're just trying to fill you up with, with something that didn't cost them very much anyway. So I think that's been a real, again, philosophical change in expectations. But I want to go back to something you did say, and that is, that we've been talking about some of these new developments with sourcing flour, ancient grain discoveries, working, new concepts in, and better quality ingredients. But still, I think at the end of that you said, but you still have to bake it, and having the best ingredients. And this is I think it was always been a problem. I saw this in the pizza world, where when a lot of restaurant chefs started adding pizzas to their menu because Wolfgang made it so popular, that and Alice and everything. So all of a sudden they're doing pizzas, but the pizzas weren't memorable. But they had all these great chef ingredients on top. And so just having the ingredients doesn't make something, like life-changing or memorable. You have to know what to do with them when you have them. And I think that that's the other piece of this equation. And that goes again to training, I think, and finding the right people to be able to execute that. Look at what they're doing up at Manresa. They've got this great, Michelin-starred restaurant, but they're also and they want to have their own bread too. So they set up a bakery. We had Avery Rosica do a demo for us here a few months ago in the symposium, and the bakery itself is trying to bake bread, and is baking bread comparable to the rest of the food that's going on the menu. So they're dedicating themselves to that. So I think that's another example, just one of many examples. And like the guy in Louis in New York City with Lode doing something different. A lot of people are grinding their own flour, but I've had some freshly ground flour house-made breads that were still a little meh, but they have, and so that's when they need somebody to come and say, okay, now you've got the ingredients. Here's what you can do to take it to another level.
Right.
And I know that, like you say, you didn't come at it from the scientific standpoint, but what do you think are those things, the things that you, once you have the ingredients, once you have the great palette to work with of ingredients, what is it that you need to do? What do you need to do to take those ingredients and make something special out of them? Because you have to create things all the time for your restaurants.
Yeah, right. Well, I think for myself, and this isn't only in the bread world, but I think it's kind of in the food world, the salad world. I feel like I need to have, I've needed to have to experience that loaf, say, of bread to know what my bar is. So for myself, my sort of life-changing moment was back in and I feel like it's so late in my career. I was probably 25 when I had my first slice of poilâne bread. And it's when you have something like that and you say, wow, now I get it. Now I understand what bread is all about. And once you have that loaf, and then for me, that was followed up by, my initial thought was, wow, guess that's something that can never be reproduced in America, because I never had anything like that in America. And probably the following year is when I was able to have for the first time Steve Sullivan's bread at Acme. And that was the next moment, because it's like, okay, it can be produced in this country and I can do it. But I wouldn't have been able to stand with handfuls of grains and say, what am I going to do to turn this into something? I needed to see that something. I needed to have a loaf of Acme bread. I needed to have a slice of the poilâne miche, because once you've had it, then you know what your bar is. And so that's when I say again, there's almost no excuse to have a bad loaf of bread, because there's so many great loaves out there.
Yeah.
That if you know what they are, then you can get there. And, sometimes I talk about, or I joke about, how I wasn't able to approach my bread making from a scientific standpoint because there wasn't the science available. There was a very, very technical book that I bought that, wow, I could not understand what I was reading.
Right.
And that was it. There was Elizabeth David, and there was Laurel's, what was it called? Laurel's Kitchen or something?
Laurel's Kitchen Bread Book.
Yeah, and there was the Bread Makers of Bernard Clayton's book, and that was it. You went to a bread section, that was it. Elizabeth David, Bernard Clayton, and Laurel's Kitchen, right?
Yeah.
Those were your books. Okay, so I had to really approach mine first by experiencing it. So I knew where to go. I had my roadmap. I knew where I needed to get to. It's just I didn't know how to go. And the way I learned how to go was just complete being obsessive, relentless, not giving up, and doing everything that I could do. And what I always like to talk about, because I find it fascinating, because bread is a science. And although there's lots of things that you can do to it, in the end, it's very limited, as to what you can actually do. And so all these things that I did in coming up with my loaves, right, turned out to be what I should be doing. So like, for instance, you should have about 2% salt in a loaf, in your bread formula, right? I didn't know that. I did it by tasting, by watching the way my bread fermented and against the amount of salt. And this is what I came up with. And it was, 2%. I didn't know that that's what it was supposed to be. All the things that I didn't know, I tried to take a rye bread and treat it like a white bread with the heat and fermenting it at a certain temperature, and it would just turn to liquid, and thinking, I guess rye is different, and so therefore I need to do everything colder, and again, never read that anywhere. So you get to where you have to go if you persevere. There's no question. There's faster ways of getting places, which I could have done, but in the end, I feel like I wouldn't have taught myself as much as I did in the process is if I just looked up 2% salt. Okay, from now on, I'll just do 2%. I never knew that.
Right. Yeah, there's something to be said for kind of intuiting your way into it, as opposed to following a formula.
But having that model out there.
Yes, well, I think that's the key thing
that you put on on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And then just get to there. Just get there.
That's so key, because basically what you're saying is if I see something that impresses me, then I'm going to want to figure out how I can do something that good as well. And so, and I know that one of the ways you go and get those inspirational ideas is you travel a lot, you taste a lot, somebody wrote in that, you've spent a lot of time in Italy for a lot of your inspiration, but where do you go in the United States to be inspired?
Wow. Every single place I go, again, every place I go to. So, I mean, and, I think it's always, and I was just thinking about this the other day. It's always that the baked grain that draws me in, that I'm just fascinated. I think that's my flavor palette. So I was just in New York doing an event with American Express. And I think the two best things I ate, I didn't have a lot of meals out because I was actually working, but the two greatest things I had was the bread at Lodi. Okay, and then another thing that I had, and I have no qualms about borrowing people's successes. They do something at another one of my favorite restaurants in Manhattan, in the Village, which is called King.
King?
It's a little restaurant run by two women and a tiny little kitchen.
Two women, and they called the restaurant King?
Yeah, well, it's on King. I used to call it Queen because I assumed the name was Queen until I found out it's not Queen, it's King, and it's because it's on King and 6th Avenue. So.
It just proves that irony still exists.
But so what they do is they do a dish, a starter, with carta de musica, which I love.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to ask you this, actually, I look at some of the recipes for carta de musica. Some of them have yeast. Have you ever made carta de musica?
Yes, I have made it when I was doing my first pizza book. And for those who don't know, carta de musica is it's from Sardinia, right? It's Sardinian flatbread, and it's thin. Chris, it's almost like when I had it, I said this is like the bottom half of a pita bread. If you split the pita bread, it's the bottom half, and you kind of can dry it a little bit, and it's crispy, and it looks like parchment, which is why they call it.
Yeah, and it's carta de musica because the dough is supposed to be stretched so thin that you can read a sheet of music below it.
Yeah,
it's exactly like that. Put it in a hot oven. It blows up like a pita, and as soon as it comes out of the oven, you peel it apart and stack it on top of each other so it softens. But basically, what you're getting is a cracker.
Yeah.
And I think it could be one of those things where you've got to be in Sardinia, possibly to fall in love with it, because it's not embellished with anything ordinarily. It's just a very thin crackery, right? And if it's made with good flour, you taste the wheat. But what they do, and I always thought that they made their own, this is what I was trying to say, I thought they led me to believe they did. They don't, they buy it. But what they do is they take this thin cracker and they throw it on the grill for seconds. So it actually burns in a couple places, but apparently, and I'm going to try this, is why I'm telling you this. And when you asked me about inspiration,
yeah,
and it softens it just enough that they can kind of scrunch it up. So what happens is they're able to pile it on a plate, all kind of scrunched up. Visually, it's beautiful. Now, the way they served it at their restaurant this time was it sat, the very bottom one sat in a very thin pool of olive oil that had fried rosemary, so it was crunchy at the bottom. So by the time you got to the bottom, it was even more delicious.
Oh.
But the way they used to serve this carta de musica is they did not heat it up and crunch it up like they're doing now, which I think is more brilliant. But what they did is they had this sheet, and on this sheet, they garnished it like with very delicate little things, like creme fraiche, caviar, this, all over, and it covered it where you could just break it off and eat like a cracker that was topped.
yes.
And I love this idea, but I love the crunched up one even more. So that's where I get my inspiration. I eat out to be inspired. I try to eat out to be inspired and not to eat out to criticize, right? And I find that everywhere I go, there's something that inspires me.
Well, I think that's a great place to kind of end this phase of the conversation, because that's a perfect takeaway for everybody. I think it is, and I get excited to hear that, the creative process is a very exciting thing. And I think, and most people sell themselves short. They think there's only a few people that come up with these great ideas, but if you see it, then you can, probably create it, and if you want to. But you have to have, as you said, you have to be a little stubborn about it as well. You have to be relentless. And so thank you for sharing all of that, these great stories. And what we're going to do, Nancy, is in a minute, we'll log out of this webinar that we're in. Okay. And then you have another link that you received that will allow you to log back in for what we call the after party. And we're going to go, and it'll be more interactive. So a lot of the people who are watching will join us, those who have the ticket for the VIP after party. And you can stay as long as you'd like to stay with us, and can stay. I know you've got a lot of other things going on. But I want to thank you, and again, really appreciate you being with us today.
It's fun. Get to talk about things that I love.
Exactly. And before we sign off, let me mention to all of you to come back on Monday. Let's see, Monday we have Tony Tipton Martin will be on with us, and she has a panel with Erica Council and Adrian Lipscomb, and they're going to be talking about what's called the missing mix in baking, which really is about diversity, the need to expand, the opportunities for people of color to get into the baking category. And there's a lot of challenges there. So they're going to talk about the things that they've come up against. And then next Wednesday, for those of you who came on early today, you saw the video about the Altamora bread. And you probably had it at the source.
I have. Wow, it's fantastic.
So next Wednesday, Fred Dancer of Puratos is going to do a demo on how to make the Altamora bread here, wherever you are. So join us next week, and then we'll continue on. We've got Nathan Meerwald coming on in a couple of weeks to announce the new modernist pizza book that's about to come out, and we have about another month before we reach the end of this year's extended symposium. So Nancy, thank you so much for being a part of it. I'm going to say goodbye to all of you here and log out. You can log out too, and we'll regroup in about 2 or 3 minutes. We can come back in.
You got it.
Okay, guys, thank you so much.
So can we mute for 2 or 3 minutes? We'll come back in. Is Herbie still around? So taste it.